So the betrayals of the NDP government, they were destroyed in the polls from this, and there was a zombie government for several years. The election didn't happen until 1995, and interestingly, through most of this period, the Liberals were first place in the polls, but in the 95 election, with the polarization of the Ray period, Mike Harris came forward to win. And the Liberals couldn't make up their mind whether they were an austerity government or a reformist government. And again, people wanted clear solutions. So from Ray's NDP, we ended up with Mike Harris's common sense revolution. Yes, for all those reformists who think the word revolution is unpopular, it was actually used by the right wing to win government in 95. Now, who do the NDP bureaucrats blame for their defeat? The unions. The unions, who should have shut up, shouldn't have complained, should have realised that Ray did the best thing possible for them. That Ray stopped. If it wasn't for Ray Day, somewhere between 20 and 40,000 workers would have been laid off. So it's except one cut to not have another cut. Bullshit. They should have taken it from the bosses. They didn't touch corporate taxation. I guess being a right reformist means never having to say you're sorry, and just blame the left. Yeah, you see that again with sort of the Hillary Clinton Democrats, right? Who blame the victory of Donald Trump on Bernie Sanders and the left, rather than looking for their own failures. So, Harris came to power on, unlike Doug Ford, on a very honest program of class war and counter-revolution. He said exactly what he was going to do, and he bragged about it. He said we kept all of our promises. It was like, yes, and all of your promises were terrible. So it was a 21% cut in welfare rates for the poorest of the poor. They completely revoked Bob Ray's labour law reforms. So all that moderation that Ray showed, all gone. Sort of like watering it down. So the anti-scab legislation was gone. Card check certification of unions were gone. Massive cuts to childcare. They deliberately demonised poor people. It was a political program of demonising the poor, and they instituted workfare. They forced 300,000 people on welfare to do 17 hours work for below minimum wage. Okay? And this it's total slavery conditions. It's just one step up from the chain gang. And if the work needs doing, well, then it should be paid for at union rates. This attack on the poor led to sort of the rise in sort of OCAP, Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, which was working amongst welfare recipients and homeless people. So in total, so the initial cut, there was layoffs of nurses, shutdown of hospitals, layoffs, 10,000 public sector cuts. Right, so Bob Ray said, we saved them from the cuts. No, you didn't. You prepared the way for the Mike Harris cuts. Privatisation, 407, and another end of Ontario Hydro. In total, $1.9 billion of cuts. 50% came out of welfare rolls. 50% came out of the poorest people in society. Now, but the unions were initially passive. Harris has got a mandate. We can't just oppose them immediately. Even Sid Ryan was quoted along those lines. And after the unions had basically sat out the 95 election, they refused to campaign for the NDP. I think a lot of them didn't technically disaffiliate, but they gave a $1 donation to the NDP, where instead, yes, what they should have been doing is replacing all of these social contract candidates with socialists. Maybe run Kormos as a potential leadership replacement against. And Kormos did actually run for the leadership, I think, after Ray resigned, but didn't do as well, and didn't have. Actually, I'm not sure how much support he had from the unions, but they didn't mobilise, whereas they should have been mobilising for socialists. Right? That's how they could have beat back against this. And actually, in terms of the legacy of the Ray government, only just now, more than 20 years later, 25 years later, only now has the NDP in Ontario actually recovered from this betrayal. Right? They tried to use Bob Rae against the NDP. I don't think it worked in this election as much. But that only now have they actually recovered, 25 years later. It's incredible. 25 years since the social contract. So that's the legacy of betrayal. You should remember that. And so the unions were inactive when Harris first came to power. And Paul Kellogg has sort of written a paper. Although it says draft only, not for quotation without permission of the author. Sorry, Paul. Got a quote. And Paul Kellogg is currently a sort of an independent academic left. He was with the Cliff group, the International Socialists, in the 90s, and he said, well, a sort of initial mobilising force that prepared the way for the anti-Harris movement was actually the Canadian Federation of Students in January of '95, before the election, organised a cross-Canada student strike that had about 100,000 students on strike, and the workers were enthused by this after a long period of no struggle, and said, yeah, we should be doing it like the students. So Paul Kellogg says that's true, but that's the only source I've got for that. And then with the victory of Harris, there was a series of minor actions by the left, OCAP, and a grouping called the Embarrass Harris Coalition. And they organised in June of '95. 2,500 came out to protest Harris's swearing in. And then in July '95, 1,000 daycare workers went out on a wildcat walkout against the daycare cuts, against the childcare cuts. Later in July, OCAP and Embarrass Harris organised a protest of welfare recipients with about 2,000 there. In August, OCAP organised a protest of 600. And on the opening of the legislature in September of '95, the Embarrass Harris Coalition, together with the Toronto and New York Labour Council, organised 10,000 people at Queen's Park. So there was a momentum from the left that was cutting against the bureaucratic inertia of the trade union leadership that just wanted to sort of didn't want to mobilise, and that's a similar stage to what we're in right now, but a lot worse. Where you had the $15 protest about a month ago, but that had about 1,500 people out at it, and there was nothing on inauguration. There's a protest next weekend, but against Doug Ford, but it's been put off, and we'll see. The left is quite disorganised and disunited. The largest meeting after the election was organised by Fightback, organised by us. We had over 100 people out, and the other left-wing groups, like Fight for 15 organised a meeting, about 50 people. Briar Patch organised a meeting a couple of weeks later. It was about 90 people. So the left is actually quite disunited and not organised. But that's the present situation that we can discuss later. But this pressure from the left, according to Paul Kellogg, played a role in radicalising a special convention of the Interior Federation of Labour towards the end of 1995, where 2,000 delegates came out and voted for the Metro Days of Action, a series of citywide general strikes. And this began a momentum specifically called a Fightback campaign against the Harris cuts. Now this began the first day of action, and these are all illegal strikes, if you remember. So relative to where the movement is right now, this is amazing. Illegal strikes are almost never heard of today. So in December of '95, the first day of action was in London. Again, you see the sort of the psychology of the labour leaders: start small, start modest. But it was a rousing success. About 40,000 of the 60,000 workers in London came out on strike, and 16,000. And the way that these days of action were structured is that you'd have a citywide general strike on the Friday and then a protest on the Saturday. So they had about 40,000 on strike on the Friday, and then 16,000 marched in minus 40 degrees weather the following day. One of the slogans is "It's not as cold as Harris." You know. But the real breakthrough was the Hamilton Day of Action in February of '96, where 100,000 workers came out on strike. In fact, one of the main organisers for that was Andrew Horvath, who was a city councillor at the time. It's interesting; these names pop up a lot, you know. And that was a real boost, and the demand was coming to like, look, the city by city stuff is too slow. But the Monday after the Hamilton Day of Action, OPSU went out on strike against massive layoffs, and this general, the shock at the cuts, the beginning of a fight back started to have an impact Harris's popularity. That he was down to 34%, and the Liberals were actually ahead of the Conservatives in the polls, although the NDP was still languishing in the teens. Right? But this was having an effect in diminishing the popularity of the Harris government. But the OPSU strike, is linked in the consciousness of the workers directly to the Metro Days of Action. And the slogans, hey Mike, how do you like a general strike? And city by city is way too slow, let's shut down Ontario. Right? So the entire logic is towards a province-wide general strike. But the labour bureaucracy continued to sort of resist this. And then eventually the OFL strike lasted 5 weeks, but they went down to defeat because it wasn't generalised, and they ended up facing something 10,000 job cuts out of that. One poll put, but the movement was incredibly popular. One poll put that 63% supported the OFL's Fightback campaign. So Hamilton, major industrial city, home of steel, and this would be a great launching point for a general strike to bring down the government. And that's the logic of this motion, of this movement, is a general strike to bring down the government. It is the logic of the movement against Doug Ford. This government has no democratic legitimacy. It has no mandate for its attacks. And this can seem like some sort of crazy, far-off perspective. Well, actually, this has happened numerous times in history. In 2012, the Quebec, we're currently in Montreal. In 2012, the Quebec students brought down the Liberal government of Jean Charest. That was the a direct outcome of 400,000 people in the streets of Montreal protesting the law that limited protests. Right? Brought down that government. In Britain, strike of the miners brought down the Conservative government in 1974. Brought in a Labour government in a condition of crisis. So this was entirely the logic of the movement: bring down the government. And this was the demand of OCAP's main spokesperson, John Clark, who did play a major role in this. And he's a revolutionary. He refuses to say whether he's a Marxist or an anarchist in public. His perspective and his demand was to make the province ungovernable, bring down the government. And OCAP was quite influential. And John Clark was a speaker on a large number of these rallies, even the ones organised by the unions, because they couldn't. You think of OCAP as a fairly peripheral group now, on the far left, but then it did have a definite constituency of support. But instead of escalating from Hamilton, the bureaucrats went backwards. So in April, they went to Kitchener-Waterloo, and my apologies to Peter and the other Waterloo comrades. It's not the industrial centre that Hamilton is. But the Kitchener-Waterloo Labour Council actually demanded to make the Kitchener Day of Action a province-wide general strike. So we don't just want to do our town, we want to do the whole province. In June, they moved to Peterborough. Again, it's just kind of moving it around, just trying to, in essence, tire people out, to be seen to be doing something. Again, every movement, every revolution is not a single march to victory. There's periods of advance, there's periods of retreat. But another incredible high point of this movement, from a sort of a lull after Hamilton, was the October Toronto General Strike. 1 million workers out on strike. I think it's the largest strike in Canadian history. The following day, 250,000 demonstrating in front of Queen's Park. So the lawn of Queen's Park probably holds about 10 to 15,000 people. So it was the entire length of University Avenue. For those, the entire wide boulevard. How wide is University Avenue? It's got to be almost 100 meters wide, maybe 50 to 100 meters wide. So the entire length of University Avenue. Who talks about this? Who talks about this? 250,000 people and demonstration, million people out on strike in Toronto. How many kids even know about this? Right? This is part of our history, forgotten history. Mike Harris. Not an intelligent man, but cunning and perceptive. You know what he said about this? He said, it was a good show. And he was right. Because the Labour leaders, that's all it was. It was a show. It was just a show. Harris said, yeah, by the time we're over, every blade of grass in Queen's Park is going to be trampled numerous times, but in the end, there's no alternative. And it didn't threaten, these demonstrations, the citywide general strike didn't threaten the Harris regime. And then from that high point, which could have been the launching point for a province-wide general strike, 1 day, 2 day, 1 week, potentially open-ended, bring down the government, they withdrew. Sudbury, Thunder Bay, North Bay, Harris's hometown, right? Smaller, de-escalated through 2006 and early 2007. So it looks like the movement was petering off. But sometimes revolution is the whip of counter-revolution. And in June of 97, Harris moved 2 more vicious attacks. Bill 136 that would attack the broader public sector, municipal, health and school workers, and Bill 160 attacking the teachers. Bill 136, it suspended the right to strike for 400,000 workers in municipalities. It gave the open right to privatise and rewrite contracts of workers. So this re-enraged the movement. QP led the call for a general strike, supported by CAW. OFL convention in July, a month later, 2,500 delegates, the largest ever OFL convention. Unanimous support for a general strike, all-out general strike, province-wide general strike, but with no date. Delegates went, tell us the date, tell us the date. Refused, no date. No date, no strike. In fact, Bill 136 also initially affected the police. And the police almost joined the Common Front. Toronto Police Union almost joined the Common Front. At which point Harris quickly backtracked and removed the police from Bill 136. That was getting a bit too scary. And this movement forced the government to backtrack on 136. Again, power of the working class. And this was a threat of a general strike, not an actual general strike. But they continued with 160 and attacking the teachers. Prep time was halved from 80 minutes to 40 minutes, I think it was, or 80 hours to 40 hours, 80 to 40, something. And the year was extended by 2 weeks with no increase in pay. And 10,000 lost teachers' jobs. In response to this, the teachers went on an illegal walkout in October and November of '97. And the public, 70% of the public supported the teachers. This could have led to the general strike. 3 key options, 3 periods. Hamilton, Toronto, and the teachers' illegal walkout could have led to general strike to bring down the government. Again, wasn't done. There was a demo to support the teachers, 25,000 people yelling, general strike, general strike. Didn't happen. Teachers' unions ended up splitting amongst themselves. Half of them signed, capitulated to the struggle, and the teachers' unions never asked for sympathy strikes, even though QP and CAW probably would have come out if they had. This fizzled out. This was defeated. Bill 160 was passed. In November of '97, the Ontario Federation of Labour Convention. There was the old president of the OFL stepped down. There was significant division between the Common Front unions, QPCAW, and the Pink Paper, the steelworkers. And the dynamic had shifted towards the right with demoralisation. And the right won the president position. Wayne Samuelson was elected the new president. Although at the same time he was elected, there was a unanimous vote for a general strike. There's 3 OFL, 3 instances a general strike could have happened, and 3 conventions. First of all, voting for the Metro Days of Action, and then 2 other conventions voting for a general strike, but no date. There was 2 sort of routine Metro Days of Action after that, St. Catharines and Kingston. But then in July of '98, the Days of Action movement was quietly shut down. Totally, it was almost not reported in the media. The movement was defeated. QP returned to the NDP, and the CAW went in the direction that we all know of strategic voting. Buzz Hargrove famously embraced Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin in the 1996 election, and now Unifor was on the right of the movement. So this whole thing about, the left being anti-NDP and the right being pro-NDP, well, that was true at that point in time, but now, 20 years later, we've seen how these developed. And you've seen Unifor on the right of the movement, raiding, supporting the liberals. Unifor being the successor of the CAW. But the reality is that Harris could have been brought down. Could have been brought down due to union power. Could have been, and the unions could have also revolutionized the NDP if they had had a socialist perspective, which of course they did not. And they weren't helped by the left. So reading into a lot of these articles, the way it's termed is the electoralist and anti-electoralist factions. So the left and CAW and QP were anti-electoralist, while steelworkers and the right wing were electoralist. So the left was reinforcing all of the prejudices. The non-union left was reinforcing all the prejudices of the Labour bureaucrats. It's just a sort of like a personal conflict, between Buzz Hargrove and Sid Ryan on one side, and Bob Rae and Alexa McDonough, the federal NDP leader, on the other side, right? Where in fact it should have been take back the NDP for working class people. Rather than the left following into this, oh yeah, you should split away, Split away to what? Well, they split away to strategic voting. They split away to the Liberals. That's what they did. So the lesson, one of the lessons is crisis inherent in reformism. And that's a lesson both for the NDP leadership and the union leadership. If you do not have a revolutionary socialist perspective, you will always capitulate at the end of the day, because there is no other way to do it while maintaining the capitalist system of production for profit. And the other lesson is crisis of leadership and the need for revolutionary working class organisation, the need for the revolutionary tendency. What the international Marxist tendency, what Fightback and La Riposte Socialiste are building. Because the left, they were complaining, it's like, we worked so hard, we got these initial demonstrations, and we wanted to bring the unions in, but once we brought the unions in, we lost all control. Well, yeah, because you had no perspective of building a revolutionary organisation that could challenge for the leadership of the mass organisations of the working class, either within the NDP or within the unions. So of course you were sidelined. You need to build the revolutionary organisation. And you need, and a key demand, which was raised by parts of the left, but they did not have the ability to put forward, was the need of rank and file control, for rank and file organs of struggle. That, in essence, workers' councils, Soviets, we wouldn't use those terms in general parlance, but you needed structures of struggle that aren't just controlled by the union bureaucracy, but are open to the rank and file militants, to the shop stewards, to the local leaders, and to non-union workers. All sectors of the working class and all sectors of the oppressed. And a revolutionary organisation can play an important role in calling for that and demanding for that. A parliament of the oppressed, a parliament of the exploited, to not allow the union bureaucracy just to control the timeline. So in fact, all of these days of action, when one was finished, it was like, thanks for coming, see you later. We'll be back to you. So nobody knew when the next one was going to happen, and no one knew what, and there was no plan for escalation. So the other lesson is the crisis of leadership and the need for revolutionary organisation. As an individual, as a movement, you do not have the ability to challenge the Labour bureaucracy. You must build a revolutionary organisation. And so this is the current situation we find ourselves in. The current situation we find ourselves in with the Doug Ford government and the potential CAC government in Quebec. And there are going to be vicious attacks. We should expect them. And We're seeing rumblings in the world economy with protectionism from south of the border, from Donald Trump. This could trigger a global economic crisis. The world, it's like the boom bust cycle is due for a new crisis. So within the next 1, 2, 3 years tops, during the life of the Ford government, there's quite likely to be an economic crisis. And these attacks are going to be incredibly hard upon people. Incredibly hard. Now, there are similarities, but there are also differences with the 1990s. Organizationally, the left is far weaker than the 90s. The only part of the left that really is advancing is the Marxists of the International Marxist Tendency, Fightback and Larry Post. The rest of the left really can't get their act together. And we don't pretend we're bigger than we are. Our forces are still quite modest. Although we have a role to play, we are probably the largest organization on the revolutionary left. And so we have a role to play in organizing protests and demonstrations and events, explaining the attacks on working class people and explaining the way forward. But we cannot be substitutionalists. We cannot mobilize the many millions of the Ontario and Quebec workers. That is the job of the mass organizations. That is the job of the unions of the NDP. We can't do it, but we must demand that they do their duty. We must demand that the leaders of the mass organizations do their duty and put them under pressure and do what we can to show what is possible with our limited yet growing forces. But so the left is a lot weaker, and the organizations of the working class are a lot weaker. The NDP has gone through, again, 25 years of betrayal. They actually returned to old reformism in this election, but still do not have the traditions of the previous period. And the unions, oh my God, the unions. They're raiding, they're capitulating to back to work legislation. Right? So the organizations of the working class have never been in such a dire situation. Right? Even the concept of, it's like this period, there were illegal strike after illegal strike after illegal strike. Incidentally, nothing happened. There was no there's no repercussions for those illegal strikes. But the idea of a legal strike now is like, oh my God, you can't break the law. Right? So the organizations of the working class are far, far weaker now. But the global situation is far, far better. The 90s were a general period of reaction after the fall of the Soviet Union and the economic slump. Now we're in a general condition of international revolution. Right? That you've had, the Sanders phenomenon, Jeremy Corbyn, Mélenchon, the lesson of the rise and fall of the Syriza government, Podemos, massive backlash amongst the youth against capitalism. So we're there, while the organizations are weak, the potential for struggle is strong. Where people in the 90s were talking of the crisis of socialism, now they're talking about the crisis of capitalism. The youth overwhelmingly are in favor of socialism, and a large minority is in favor of communism. So these are the different conditions. And it's the job of the revolutionary Marxists to reach these layers and demand that the workers' organizations play the role that they need to play to fight back against this inevitable capitalist austerity. And you cannot fight back against it with mild reformism. The betrayal is inherent in reformism. But eventually these movements will put the reformists in power. Eventually the NDP will end up back in power in Ontario. Quebec Solidaire, possibly in Quebec. They end up in power, and they will be in exactly the same conditions as the Bob Rae government. Exactly the same conditions. And we need to learn from that and build the revolutionary opposition until Marxism becomes a mass force. and can mobilize the workers, and sweep all this shit away. And that is the period opening up to us, comrades. It is not going to be easy due to our weakness and the weakness of the workers' movement. It will be protracted. Working class people will face incredible hardships, sadly. But if we do the job now, if we build in the coming period, Marxism will be present to play the decisive role. Thank you.